Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take complex foundational ideas, pull them apart, and really get to the core concepts you need, faster, clearer. Today, we're diving into genetics, the absolute basics. We want to build that essential roadmap, the history, the structure, the function that you need to navigate this really powerful field of science. And we can start somewhere very personal, your genome. Every single cell in your body carries these incredibly thin, coiled threads of DNA. It's the master set of instructions, basically. When the Human Genome Project finished up around 2001, that gave us the first complete look at anonymous human DNA. But then, just a few years later, maybe 2007, the cost just plummeted. And suddenly getting your own specific genetic code analyzed wasn't science fiction anymore. It became a real possibility. And that rapid shift, that personalization, is exactly why understanding these fundamentals is so crucial now.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because even before anyone knew what DNA actually looked like, the early thinkers in genetics, they had already figured out what the stuff of inheritance had to do. They laid down the rules.
Yeah, there were three fundamental requirements. First, whatever this material was, it needed to replicate itself with incredible accuracy, so information passes reliably from generation to generation. Second, it absolutely had to encode information.
Yeah.
Complex instructions, for building and running an entire organism, development, function, everything.
And the third one, this feels like the big one for biology itself. It needed the capacity to change, to allow for mutation, for variation.
Exactly. Without change, no differences, no evolution.
So it has to be super stable, but also capable of changing sometimes. That's the paradox, isn't it?
It really is the core paradox of life, in a way. And the first person to sort of crack the code on how this information gets passed down was Gregor Mendel.
Right. Mendel, his paper from 1866 just sat there for decades, pretty much ignored.
All while he was busy crossbreeding thousands and thousands of pea plants, tracking simple traits like height short versus tall. And from that, he deduced the basic rules of inheritance, without ever seeing a gene or a DNA.
And his key insight was that inheritance wasn't like mixing paint, not some fluid blending. He realized these hereditary factors, what we now call genes, were distinct things, discrete entities. He also figured out that genes come in different versions, which we call alleles. So for height, you might have a tall allele and a short allele. And the mechanism he proposed is spot on. Organisms have two copies of each gene, but when they make reproductive cells gametes, like egg or sperm, each gamete gets only one copy.
Okay, so it has the genetic information.
Right. And then fertilization brings two gametes together, restoring the two copies in the offspring, the zygote.
So the instruction set is neatly packaged, divided, and then reassembled. And didn't he also find that different genes are passed on independently?
Yes, that was crucial. The gene controlling height didn't influence the inheritance of, say, the gene for flower color. They sorted independently. This idea of separate packaged units was revolutionary when people finally rediscovered his work around 1900.
So Mendel gives us the rules. But the next giant leap, Watson and Crick in 1953, they gave us the physical thing. They answered, okay, but what is a gene?
And the answer was, it's a nucleic acid, made of these building blocks called nucleotides. Every nucleotide has three parts. There's a phosphate group, a sugar molecule, and then one of those nitrogen-containing bases.
And the sugar is the key difference between DNA and RNA.
Right, exactly. Deoxyribose in DNA, hence the D, and ribose in RNA, the R, and those bases, they're like the letters of the genetic alphabet. DNA uses A, G, C, and T adenine, guanine, cytosine, thymine. RNA uses A, G, C, and U uracil instead of thymine.
Okay, so 4 letters each. And Watson and Crick's big insight, the double helix, showed how it all fit together.
Precisely. They figured out DNA is a duplex, 2 chains wrapped around each other, but the absolute key was the pairing rule. Weak hydrogen bonds hold the chains together, but only between specific pairs.
The A always pairs with T.
And G always pairs with C. Always.
That strict rule means the 2 strands are complementary, doesn't it? If you know one side, you automatically know the other.
Exactly. If one strand reads AGCT, the other must read TCG opposite it. This complementarity defines the molecule, all coiled up in that famous helical configuration.
Understanding that structure really opened the floodgates, leading to the third milestone, genomics, and the massive Human Genome Project, the HGP.
Right. If Watson and Crick showed us the letters and the structure, genomics aimed to read the entire book. The genome is just the complete set of DNA for an organism, and the HGP was this enormous international effort to sequence all of it for humans' roughly 3 billion nucleotide pairs.
And did it throw up some surprises? I remember the initial estimates for the number of human genes were way higher.
Oh, absolutely. People were guessing maybe 30,000, even 40,000 genes. The thinking was, well, humans are complex, so we must have loads of genes.
But the actual number turned out to be much lower.
Much lower, around 20,500 protein coding genes, which is, not that many more than some simpler organisms.
So complexity isn't just about the number of parts.
Not at all. It's much more about how those parts, the genes, are regulated, how they're switched on and off, how they interact. That's a huge part of the story.
And this whole field of studying the entire set of sequences, that's genomics.
That's genomics. It relies heavily on sequencing technology, robotics, powerful computers, and these huge public databases like the ones at NCBI, the National Center for Biotechnology Information. We now have genome sequences for countless species, mosquitoes, honeybees, trees.
Okay, so we know the structure, we know the scale. How does DNA actually do its job? You mentioned two main functions, propagating information and using it.
Exactly. Let's start with propagating it, making sure it gets passed on accurately. That's DNA replication.
And this relies on that complementarity we talked about.
Absolutely. It's incredibly elegant. The two strands of the DNA duplex unwind and separate.
Okay.
Then each of those separated strands serves as a template. The cell machinery brings in new nucleotides, and following the strict AT-GC pairing rules, it builds a new partner strand for each of the original templates.
So from one DNA molecule, you end up with two.
Two identical DNA duplexes, perfect copies most of the time. That's how information is faithfully transmitted.
All right, that's replication. What about the other function actually using the information? That's gene expression.
Right. This is where the DNA sequence, the gene, provides the instructions to build things the cell needs, primarily proteins.
Proteins are the workhorses of the cell.
They are. They're long chains of amino acids, also called polypeptides. And the instructions for building a specific polypeptide are encoded in the gene sequence.
How is that code read?
It's read in three-letter words called codons. Each codon is a sequence of 3 adjacent nucleotides, and each codon specifies which amino acid should be added next to the growing polypeptide chain.
3 letters code for one amino acid. Okay. But the DNA is kind of locked away in the nucleus in many organisms. How does the message get out to where proteins are actually built?
That involves a two-step process. First comes transcription.
Transcription, like copying something down.
Exactly. The DNA sequence of a gene is copied or transcribed into a related molecule called messenger RNA or mRNA.
And RNA uses U instead of T, right?
Correct. So when the mRNA copy is made, wherever there's an A in the DNA template, a U is put into the mRNA strand. G still pairs with C.
Okay, so now we have this mRNA message. What happens next?
Next comes translation. The mRNA molecule travels out of the nucleus to the protein building machinery. There, the mRNA acts as the template. The machinery reads the codons on the mRNA, and for each codon, it brings in the corresponding amino acid and links it to the chain, building the polypeptide step by step.
This is nowhere to start.
Yes, there's usually a specific start codon, often the one coding for the amino acid methionine that signals the beginning of the protein sequence.
So the overall flow is DNA gets transcribed into RNA.
And then RNA gets translated into polypeptide or protein.
That's the famous central dogma of molecular biology.
That's it. DNA, right arrow, RNA, right arrow, polypeptide. That's the main information pathway in biology.
Are there exceptions?
There are. Some viruses, like HIV, which causes AIDS, can actually do reverse transcription. They use an RNA template to make DNA, so they reverse that first step.
Interesting.
And it's also important to remember that not all genes code for proteins. For many genes, the final functional product is actually the RNA molecule itself. It doesn't get translated.
Right, okay. So replication is incredibly accurate, but we started by saying change, mutation, is also essential. Let's talk about mutation.
Yes, mutation is simply any change in the DNA sequence. It could be a tiny change, like one base swapping for another, or larger changes like deletions or duplications of DNA segments.
What causes mutations?
They can happen spontaneously, maybe errors during replication that don't get fixed, or they can be induced by external factors like radiation or certain chemicals. A gene that has undergone such a change is called a mutant gene.
Can a tiny change really have a big effect?
Oh, absolutely. A classic, powerful example is sickle cell disease. It involves the protein beta globin, which is part of hemoglobin in red blood cells. It's 146 amino acids long.
Okay.
The disease is caused by a change in just one single nucleotide pair in the entire gene. In the 6th codon, an AT pair changes to a TA pair, just that one swap.
One single letter flip causes the whole disease out of billions of letters.
That one change swaps one amino acid for another glutamic acid gets replaced by valine, and that single amino acid change dramatically alters the shape and function of the hemoglobin, causing the red blood cells to become misshapen or sickle-shaped, especially when oxygen is low. This impairs oxygen transport and causes all the symptoms of the disease.
That's staggering. But you also mentioned change is needed for evolution. How does something like sickle cell fit into that? It sounds purely negative.
Well, from one perspective it is, but mutation is the ultimate source of all genetic variation, the raw material that evolution acts upon. And the sickle cell allele, the mutant beta-globin gene, it's actually surprisingly common in some parts of the world, particularly Africa and the Mediterranean.
Why would that be?
Because of malaria. It turns out that individuals who are heterozygotes, meaning they carry one normal copy of the gene and one sickle cell copy, are significantly more resistant to malaria infection.
Ah, so carrying one copy gives you an advantage in places where malaria is common.
Exactly. The parasite has a harder time surviving in those slightly altered red blood cells. So natural selection actually favors carrying one copy of the mutant allele in those environments, even though having two copies causes severe disease.
That's a fascinating trade-off.
Right.
And can we trace these kinds of evolutionary stories by looking at DNA sequences across different species?
Absolutely. Comparing DNA sequences allows researchers to figure out evolutionary relationships. You can compare a specific gene, like cytochrome B, across many different species and build phylogenetic trees diagrams showing how closely related organisms are based on their descent from common ancestors. It's called studying phylogeny.
Okay, so genetics operates on different levels. Can we quickly outline those main approaches?
Sure. There are sort of three traditional levels. First, classical or transmission genetics. This is following in Mendel's footsteps, analyzing how traits are inherited in crosses between organisms.
Like the pea plants.
Like the pea plants, and using those inheritance patterns to figure out where genes are located on chromosomes. That's called chromosome mapping.
Then there's the molecular level.
Right, molecular genetics. This is the Watson and Crick legacy. It involves working directly with the DNA molecule itself, isolating genes, sequencing them, manipulating DNA. This is where techniques like recombinant DNA technology come in, allowing scientists to cut and paste DNA pieces, maybe put a human gene into bacteria to produce large amounts of it.
And the third level.
Population genetics. This takes the broadest view, building on Darwin and Wallace. It looks at the genetic variability within and between entire populations.
So tracking allele frequencies.
Exactly. Population geneticists study how common different alleles are and whether those frequencies are changing over time, which is essentially the definition of evolution happening at the genetic level.
These different levels of analysis, they clearly have huge real-world applications.
Yeah.
Let's touch on a few. Agriculture seems like an obvious one.
Definitely. Humans have been manipulating genetics through selective breeding for millennia. Think about corn. Modern corn looks nothing like its wild ancestor, teosinte. That's thousands of years of farmers selecting for desirable traits.
And today we have GMOs, genetically modified organisms.
Right, which takes it a step further. Instead of just selecting from existing variation, we can directly insert specific genes. A well-known example is Bt corn.
What's Bt corn?
It's corn that's been engineered to carry a gene from a bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis. This gene produces a protein that's toxic to certain insect pests, like the European corn borer.
So the corn makes its own insecticide, basically.
Pretty much. It reduces the need for spraying chemical pesticides, but of course GMOs like Bt corn have generated significant debate.
What are the main points of that debate? Safety concerns.
Yeah, concerns often revolve around potential long-term health effects for consumers, though decades of scientific consensus haven't shown unique risks compared to conventional breeding. There are also ecological concerns, like whether the Bt toxin could harm non-target insects, like monarch butterflies that might encounter the pollen. It's an area of ongoing research and regulation.
Okay, let's shift to medicine. Genetics has a long history there, too, right?
A very long history. People like Sir Archibald Garrett were writing about inborn errors of metabolism, genetic diseases, way back in 1909.
And now?
Now, molecular genetics gives us incredibly powerful tools. We have diagnostic tests for many genetic conditions, like testing women for mutations in the BRCA1 gene, which dramatically increases the risk of breast and ovarian cancer. Knowing the risk allows for proactive monitoring or preventative measures.
And we can also use genetics for treatments.
Yes. One major success is using recombinant DNA technology to produce human proteins in bacteria or yeast cells. We can make perfect human insulin for diabetics or human growth hormone just by putting the human gene into these microbial factories.
What about fixing the faulty genes themselves? Human gene therapy.
That's the ultimate goal for many genetic diseases. The idea is to deliver a healthy, working copy of a gene into the cells of a patient who has faulty copies to compensate for the defect.
How's that going? It sounds complex.
It is extremely complex, and the results so far have been, well, mixed. It hasn't yet been successful for diseases like cystic fibrosis, where getting the gene into the right cells in the lungs is very difficult.
But there have been successes.
Yes, there have been some notable successes, particularly for certain inherited immune deficiencies and blood disorders. Often, these involve taking cells out of the patient, correcting the gene in the lab, and then putting the corrected cells back in. Delivery and ensuring the gene works correctly long-term are still major hurdles.
Beyond medicine and agriculture, genetics has impacts across society, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Think about the legal system. DNA profiling is routine now for forensic investigations, establishing paternity, resolving inheritance disputes. It's had a massive impact. And economically, the entire biotechnology industry is built on manipulating genes and DNA. It's a huge global enterprise.
So looking back at this whole journey we've just traced,
It's quite a story, isn't it? We went from Mendel figuring out abstract rules by watching peas, to Watson and Crick revealing the beautiful structure of DNA, and now to genomics, where we can read and analyze entire genetic blueprints.
and running through it all is that constant theme of mutation.
Exactly. Mutation is the engine of change, the source of the variation that makes life so diverse and allows evolution to happen.
Which brings us back to where we started, the personal genome. As we learn more and more about our own individual DNA, the specific instructions that make us who we are, it really does raise some profound questions, doesn't it?
It does. Deep questions.
Questions for you, the listener, to think about. How much does our DNA define us, our talents, our personality, our health risks, maybe even our morality? If we can read our own instruction manual, how does that change our understanding of ourselves, of what it means to be human?
It's something we'll all be grappling with more and more.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fundamental principles of genetics.